đây tôi có việc rất hân hạnh được giới thiệu diễn giả khoáng đại. Ngày hôm nay, ông Patrick Brown đắc cử vào Hạ viện Gia Mã Đại lần đầu tiên trong cuộc bầu cử liên bang năm 2006. Trước đó, ông Patrick đã từng phục vụ trong Hội đồng thành phố Barrie với chức vụ nghị viên thành phố trong 2 nhiệm kỳ. Ông Patrick hiện đang giữ vai trò lãnh đạo trong lĩnh vực quốc tế của Quốc hội. Trước khi phục vụ cho Quốc hội trong lĩnh vực quốc tế, ông đã từng làm thành viên trong ban chấp hành tổ chức Liên minh Dân chủ trẻ quốc tế qua 7 năm và đã giúp đỡ những công trình xây dựng dân chủ được tài trợ bởi tổ chức Westminster Foundation. At this time, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Patrick Brown. Mr. Brown is a member of Parliament of Canada. He was first elected to the House of Commons in 2006 federal election against incumbent Liberal cabinet minister. He previously served as a two-term city councillor for the city of Barrie. Mr. Brown is currently playing a leadership role in the current Parliament in international affairs. His international experience prior to serving in the Parliament entailed serving on the executive of the International Young Democracy Union for 7 years and assisting in democracy building projects hosted by the Westminster Foundation. Xin quý vị cho một tràng pháo tay thật lớn cho ông Patrick Brown. Give him a big round of applause for Mr. Patrick Brown.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. And through this speech, I'm going to talk about a few examples that I can share with you of things I've seen and read about from the perspective as a Canadian parliamentarian. And just to make sure we're going to hear, I'll try to speak as close as I can to the mic. I got involved in politics at a very young age. I was flipping through the channels one day on TV, and I listened to a political speech, a speech by Jean Charest, who was running for the leadership of the Conservative Party. And I remember being inspired by that speech. I was 15 years old, but the way he could speak about what it meant to be a Canadian, for me, I found contagious because he spoke with such pride. And I wanted to get involved in politics, and I was told by my father that you didn't have to be 18 years old to volunteer in a political campaign. You may have to be a certain age to vote, but to participate and volunteer, you could be much younger. So at 15, I joined the Conservative Party and got very active in our youth wing. And at 22, as my introduction mentioned, I ran for office for the first time municipally. And I remember knocking on doors as a candidate at 22, and a few of the doors, they just shut on me. And people said, you know, you're too young to run for politics. And I remember running for Parliament at 27. You know, some people shut the door too. But the reason I ran was because I believed I had good ideas for my city. When I ran municipally, I really believed that we needed more recreation. When I ran federally, I really believed there was a shortage of medical professionals. And, you know, I viewed my age as a challenge. But I also viewed that I think in most societies, what counts is if your ideas are righteous, if your ideas are the right ones, and the people will give you the benefit of the doubt. And in my case, I was successful and I was elected. But what this example speaks to me about is that around the world, we must remember that age is not a barrier. What counts is your ideas. And when I look at this conference here today, you know, one thing we all have in common is we're all young. And in Barrie, I believe my ideas, and in Canada, I believe my ideas were right. They were just ideas, and they were right for my city and my country. And one thing that you have in this room, I'm unequivocally sure, but I am with complete certainty, is that your ideas are unequivocally right. You in this room are the pioneers for freedom and democracy and human rights in Vietnam. And although there may be some challenges on the way, you certainly have what is right on your side. And I think if we look throughout history, there's a tendency that those who are on the side of what is right, of what is just, in the end, always win. And that certainly should be an encouraging sign for you as you set upon this goal to bring human rights, democracy, and freedom to Vietnam. Translated from Greek, democracy simply means the people rule, not one person, not an elitist group. And I want to refer to a quote from the late American President Ronald Reagan. And at the opening reception last night, I noticed there was many delegates from California, so I think it's certainly appropriate to share a quote with you from a former California governor, and this is a quote he gave in his inaugural speech in 1967 when he became the governor of California. "Freedom is the right to question and change the established way of doing things. It is the continuing revolution of the marketplace. It is the understanding that allows us to recognize shortcomings and seek solutions. It is the right to put forth an idea, scoffed at by experts, and to watch it catch fire among the people. It is the right to follow your dream or stick with your conscience, even if you're the only one in a sea of doubters. It is the recognition that no single person, no single authority of government has a monopoly on the truth, but that every individual life is infinitely precious." And I think what Governor and then President Reagan said is equally true today. There may be a sea of doubters in Vietnam amongst the authority. They don't agree with you in terms of freedom and democracy being the best route for Vietnam. But in the end, they do not have a monopoly on truth. And I wanted to mention a few international examples to illustrate how the march towards freedom can be successful. And the first example I want to touch upon is in the Philippines. Some of you may remember that in 1986, there were some very difficult elections that were marred by violence and alleged tampering with the electoral process. The president at that time, Marcos, had abused the public trust, had ignored the Constitution, and illegally ran for a third term. And over the years, the people in the Philippines protested. They argued. They raised awareness saying this was not right, which was happening in the Philippines. And they had a giant protest. 200,000 Filipino civilians got out with leaders in the community saying that democracy had been stained by the actions of this president, and the government had trampled on their democratic rights. And the first rally failed. They had made it difficult for the government to proceed. The government had lost certainly the will of the people, but the government continued to march ahead, regardless of the trampling of democratic rights. And over 20 years, the people in the Philippines did not give up. They had their second people power revolution. They had giant protests on the streets. And after their second revolution, they were successful. And we now have democracy in the Philippines. These two movements by the Filipino people provide us with a clear-cut example of the power of people in achieving reform in government. The Filipino people wanted the freedom and democratic institutions that their neighbors to the north enjoyed. They wanted to choose their own government. They wanted to choose how they wanted to bring about change. The Filipino experience can probably be best summed up in the words of former British Prime Minister Lady Margaret Thatcher, when she said, "You may have to fight a battle more than once to win." We must remember that too when we speak of Vietnam. In the years ahead, there may be times we're successful and times we're not successful. But as Prime Minister Thatcher said, we must never give up in the face of adversity. We must continue to fight each battle, regardless of success. The ending of apartheid in South Africa also provides us with an interesting international example about the virtue of patience in fighting for democracy. In South Africa, there was a system of apartheid, a system of legalized racial segregation enforced by the National Party government between the years of 1948 and 1994. This legislation essentially gave the governing authorities the power to strip black South Africans of their citizenship and place them on pieces of land specifically designated for them. However, starting in the 1950s, the people in South Africa said this was wrong. Some of the opposition parties began to build support across South Africa that this was certainly not the right approach to freedom and democracy in South Africa. And this raising the flag of hope in South Africa gained international attention. And the United Nations got involved. They condemned the actions in South Africa. And they built international pressure. Countries began to impose sanctions on South Africa. And how this started was simply people on the streets saying their government was wrong, it was unfair, and they were trampling on their rights. In 1983, the government caved. They started to change their system. And they only had quasi-apartheid. They tried to dilute it. But in the end, the people said, if you're half wrong, you're still wrong. And they continued to protest. And eventually, in 1990, some of the people who were leaders behind this protest were released from jail. Many of you may remember on TV when Nelson Mandela was released, and thousands, hundreds of thousands of people marched with him, hoping for the change. And the government could not sustain the pressure, both domestically and internationally, and in 1991 they relented. And there was negotiations between the black and white communities in South Africa, and through the power of people, that government changed completely. The entire legal apparatus that supported apartheid was dismantled in 1991 because people would accept nothing less. The country of Ukraine provides us with a more recent example of the importance of democracy and freedom. After years of repression at the hands of their Soviet leaders, in 1989, the national movement, the People's Movement of Ukraine, known in short as RUK, was formed. In parliamentary elections, they swept. And this inevitably resulted in Ukrainian parliament adopting a declaration of state sovereignty. At the time, the Soviet Union would have none of it. Democracy for the Soviet Union at that time was completely against their core values. And they said, we're not going to allow this. But the people spoke in such mass, with such conviction, that the Soviet Union couldn't refuse. They had a referendum, and 90% of the people in Ukraine said, we are choosing the route of freedom over democracy rather than the archaic ways of the Soviet Union. And that was a message that was too strong for the leaders in Moscow to resist, and they let Ukraine continue in its way, and Ukraine became a democratic nation with a parliament elected and the first president, Leonid Kravchuk, elected by the people. Ukraine serves as a powerful example of the transformation that can occur in a country that is dedicated to promoting democracy and providing freedoms for its citizens. It has gone from being a repressed nation under the Soviet rule to becoming one of Europe's fastest growing nations. I think the late American President Ronald Reagan said it best in his remarks at a question and answer session with students at a faculty in Moscow. Progress is not foreordained. The key is freedom. Freedom of thought, freedom of information, and freedom of communication. And what I think President Reagan was getting at is that if a country is going to take off, we need to have that basic foundational piece of freedom. And yesterday I was asked a question by a radio reporter, and they said to me, shouldn't the most important thing in Vietnam not be about democracy, not be about freedom, but about getting food on people's plates? What my response to that is that if we really want to see economic growth in Vietnam, foundational values, because a country like Ukraine only took off economically when there was that stability, when they had democratic values. I would suggest to you that there is certainly hesitation in the international community about investing in Vietnam when they don't have even the basic, fundamental democratic values that we expect of a country. I think if Vietnam embraced democracy, you would see economic development flourish in Vietnam. You know, look at Taiwan. Taiwan, when they adopted a democracy a short while ago, I think it was about 15 years ago, I think there was a delegate here from Taiwan. You certainly saw tremendous economic growth when they took those steps towards a democracy that they had fought for years and years and years with China to have the right to do. And Taiwan became an example of an economic tiger in Asia. And Vietnam can be that same economic tiger that sees their gross national product simply leap by giant bounds. But the first step that needs to be taken for economic success is the building of a stable democracy. That's why I believe there's an incredible synergy, an incredible interrelation between putting food on people's plates and developing democratic values. Another example to talk about in the March for Freedom, an international example that's very relevant right now, is Pakistan. Pakistan has been governed by unelected, unaccountable military for quite some time, as the military has played an influential role in mainstream politics throughout Pakistan's history. Pakistan has had military presidents rule from 1951, 1977 to 1988, and from 1999 onwards. On November 3rd, 2007, President Musharraf declared emergency rule across Pakistan and purported to suspend the constitution, imposing martial law, and placing opposition leaders like Imran Khan and the late Benazir Bhutto on house arrest. And the Chief Justice was replaced as a result of his refusal to endorse this emergency rule. What made matters worse was that the former Prime Minister, Nawaz Sharif, lost his appeal simply to participate in elections. Musharraf justified the state of emergency, restricting the people's democratic rights, and placed the opposition leaders under house arrest by stating that he was doing it for the good of the people, to reduce militancy in the country. However, in the words of former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, to be free is better than to be unfree always. Any politician who suggests otherwise should be treated with suspect. I think those words are particularly true when we look at what's happening in Pakistan. Democracy and freedom will arrive in Pakistan because the people will not relent. The protests and cries of freedom are growing louder in Pakistan. It may not be today, may not be tomorrow, may not be a few years from now, but eventually, and hopefully it's sooner, but eventually freedom and democracy are going to arrive in Pakistan because the thunder and the thirst for freedom is growing so loud in Pakistan. And you can see the international community, you can look at the attention that it's gained, the situation in Pakistan. It's because group after group have protested on the streets saying they will not accept the continuation of a dictatorship. You know, first it was regular citizens, it was farmers, it was lawyers, it was judges. Wave after wave, people have said, we are not going to accept what is happening in Pakistan. And certainly we've seen some courageous people in that march. You know, the recent death of Benazir Bhutto, it certainly speaks to someone who's been incredibly courageous in the march for freedom. And I believe that chime is going to continue to grow louder. One can only hope that it does. In all these countries, South Africa, the Philippines, Ukraine, and Pakistan, the people are united by one thing: their desire to be part of a democratic nation that respects the fundamental freedoms that many in the West take for granted every day. Former Canadian Prime Minister John Diefenbaker perhaps said it best when making an address on democracy and freedom. Freedom is the right to be wrong, but not to do wrong. The people in all these countries have united and have made a case for this freedom. The freedom to choose their own government, a media that is free from the state, a free and impartial judiciary, and a freedom to express any belief they may have. And it's through these examples that we see the true importance of democracy and freedom. On the international level, there are a few simple steps that can be taken by organizations around the world to promote the growth of freedom and democracy. And I want to mention a few that have been done by youth groups. I think this illustrates the power we have as young citizens, as young individuals. I'm involved in an organization called the International Youth Democracy Union. And that's an organization that this invitation was extended to for me to speak. And in two examples, I think IYDU has played a role beyond its weight and beyond the typical expectations of young people. I'll give you two examples: Belarus and Zimbabwe. In Belarus, at the time, in the late 1990s, the chairman of IYDU, Andrew Rosendale, was a young MP from Bromford. And of concern for Andrew was the fact that Belarus remained the last standing dictatorship in Europe. And he said, we need to raise that flag for freedom in Belarus. What can a young person in his early 30s at the time, what can I do to make a difference? And what IYDU did is they pooled their resources and they sent computers in to the opposition groups in Belarus to give them a better ability to promote their mission, their march towards freedom. And Andrew said, you know what? I can't be scared to go into Belarus and stand up for what I believe is right. And Andrew Rosendale went to Belarus and handed out flyers about why democracy was so important and why the government of Belarus had trampled upon those fundamental freedoms. And he took the British media along with him, and it produced around 9 or 10 stories about the lack of democracy in Belarus. And although there's still a long way to go, I think examples like that show that as young people, we have the ability to raise that flag, to raise awareness like never before. Another example is Peter Gitmark, who's the current chairman of IYDU, and he's an MP in Norway. Peter Gitmark is, I think some of you may know, there's a few delegates here from Norway, but he's very concerned about the situation in Zimbabwe with the government of Robert Mugabe, who's trampled on human rights there as well. And what Peter Gitmark did, he says, obviously I'm on the opposite end of the world of Zimbabwe, but I want to raise that flag, that torch of freedom and democracy. What can I do? And he thought about it, and he got IYDU to sponsor the cost of postcards. And he got individuals to send postcards to regular citizens in Zimbabwe talking about how they're being taken for granted, how they're being abused by their government. And through one MP, Peter Gitmark, he mailed out 10,000 postcards to people in Zimbabwe to let them know how they are being abused by their government. And certainly that is a small, early 30s, said, I want to participate in the March for Freedom in Zimbabwe. And I use these two examples because that's what I see our roles are. That's what I see your roles are as pioneers for freedom in Vietnam. Is there steps you can take for raising the torch of freedom in Vietnam, for raising awareness, and whether that's handing out leaflets in Vietnam or taking a step that's more removed than sending information to Vietnam, like Peter Gitmark did in Zimbabwe, there is new means that we have as young people, and probably more so than any other generation. I'll give you a few examples. I think it's widely accepted that young people these days are much more technologically advanced than our peers in older generations. And as we look at the world, barriers and borders mean far, far less. Why? Because communication can flow that much easier. And we are particularly adept at using these new technologies, whether it's websites, Facebook, MSN, things that allow us to share knowledge globally. We are prepared for that. And we should use new technologies to express what is happening in Vietnam. Anytime there is a case of injustice, we should spread that story around the world. We need to raise that flag of abuses that occur in Vietnam. If someone from this conference, for example, goes back to Vietnam and is frowned upon, or his rights are trampled upon because he came to have expression and engage in dialogue and democracy here, certainly whatever happens to that individual should be spread across the world with enthusiasm and vigor, because those courageous enough to speak about what's right need to be protected by their peers, and we have that through the arsenal of the internet, arsenal of communication that has never been available to previous generations as much as it is to us today. And that is certainly a powerful tool we have as young people. As of the summer of 2006, there's been a total of 7 IYDU missions to Zimbabwe. And one of the things the IYDU did is they organized conferences like you are doing today, trying to bring people together in a country where it's safe to have a conference. And certainly, I think there's opportunities to engage IYDU in similar things with Vietnam, and I've been speaking to Quoc and Phong about that, but I see a lot of similarities between the goals of IYDU and the goals of your collectivity that we can certainly work on in the future with a lot of enthusiasm. Another thing I want to mention about democracy is that even in countries where we have democracy, those democratic rights need to be guarded quickly. In Canada, we had a scandal a few years ago where there was an abuse of taxpayer funds, and even in Canada, where we take democracy for granted, we had to evolve and create an accountability act to guard against things happening like that again. And I think that's one of the fragile things about democracy, is that it needs to be guarded everywhere. It needs to be protected everywhere, even where those achievements have been achieved. And Ronald Reagan used to speak that democracy is only one generation from evaporating, from slipping away. And we all recognize that fundamental core of the success of our societies. In closing, I want to leave you with the words of a former Canadian Prime Minister, Lester Pearson. We must keep on trying to solve problems, one by one, stage by stage, if not on the basis of confidence and cooperation, at least on that of mutual toleration and self-interest. The only way we are going to find freedom throughout the globe is if we take on problems that we are facing one by one. When democracy is challenged in democratic states or muzzled in dictatorial regimes, our belief and passion for democracy must be heard. Democracy must be our legacy to future generations that will inhabit this earth and carry us to new heights. You in this room are the pioneers, as I said before, the pioneers for freedom in Vietnam. And that is a tremendous opportunity, because rarely are people of a generation given the opportunity to make a mark in history. In countries where democracy has already been achieved, those fathers in the process for democracy have certainly been recognized and applauded through the lens of history. And you have that opportunity in Vietnam. You have that opportunity to carve a mark in history and leave a legacy for future generations. That is a tremendous challenge you have, but it's something that I think will be an inspiration. Your work to future generations is something that will be remembered fondly through history as a generation that had the courage to act. So thank you for inviting me here today, and I look forward to attending the rest of your conference with you.